Hello and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today in this first talk of our monthly seminar series. Today, I'm going to introduce our project and briefly go over some preliminary results. This project involves researchers here at the University of Otago, the University of Connecticut, Pennsylvania State University, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and is funded by the John Templeton Foundation. I would just like to quickly note that the video and audio is turned off for security. And I think I'll just field some questions at the end through the chat function, which is also turned off at the moment. Although just looking, I know I've at least heard of everybody who I can see in here. So if that's still the case at the end, I can turn off all of those security functions and we can just talk more freely. So I'm just going to start out today's talk with a bit of theoretical background, and it sort of underpins a lot of our research project. Human reproduction is unique. Cross-cultural studies find that despite high levels of parental investment, humans reproduce more quickly and obtain higher levels of fertility than our closest great-ape relatives. High levels of parental investment and fertility are accomplished by means of significant alloparental provisioning, which allows for earlier weaning and a shorter inter-birth interval. Among humans, alloparenting, or investment in a child by someone other than a biological parent, includes investment by kin and non-kin, although the former is much more common. Beginning about 300 years ago, industrialization in the 18th century European societies led to the dispersal of people over greater geographical ranges in pursuit of economic opportunities. As a result, kin network size and alloparental resources available to mothers diminished. Indeed, cross-cultural studies find that compared to so-called natural fertility populations, children in modern societies receive less investment from kin, particularly older siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles. It has been argued that the lower relative fertility levels of alloparental resources in modern environments contributes to reduced fertility. And additionally, in these same environments, the costs of rearing successful children are greater than under ancestral conditions. That is, successful children require higher levels of parental investment in post-industrialized settings. In addition to economic and reproductive changes, the arrival of the modern period has seen the rapid proliferation of science and technology together with diminishing participation in organized religion, a process that sociologists call secularization. These rapid social changes during the early stages of modernization caused prominent intellectuals of the day, such as Marx and Freud and Weber, to predict the rapid demise of religion. Despite their other intellectual insights, however, these thinkers were mostly wrong about the future of religion. A majority of individuals living in today's world are religious, and recent demographic predictions suggest that the world is becoming even more religious over at least the next few generations. The contemporary world is religious in large part because religious people living in modern societies tend to have more children than their secular counterparts. For evolutionary ecologists, the higher relative fertility of religious individuals in contemporary settings represents a puzzle, something that we've called the paradox of religious fertility. Studies find a negative relationship between child number and developmental outcomes for each child. For example, a child's sibling number is negative related to physiological measures such as a child's height, as well as to cognitive measures such as performance on school tests. And in adulthood, sibling number is negatively associated with an individual's socioeconomic status. It is expected that the more children parents have to care for, the less time and energy parents can invest in each child. And as such, per-child resource dilutions are responsible for the trade-off between offspring number and offspring success. Despite these general trade-offs between offspring number and child success, there's currently little evidence that children born to religious parents fare worse, despite higher fertility. So for example, this plot here on the right by David Lawson and colleagues examines performance on several measures across a cohort of over 10,000 people born in Sweden in the early part of the 20th century, where on the y-axis, you have changes in standard deviations across those measures, and on the x-axis, you have number of siblings. And you can see a decline, particularly in entering university, the more siblings that a child had. Other studies, for example, conducted in the US, show that although there is this trade-off between years of schooling and sibling number, that pattern is non-existent amongst some religious denominations, particularly in the US amongst Mormons. In our project, we integrate two lines of research as a potential solution to this paradox of religious fertility. First, studies consistently find religious people tend to be more cooperative with one another than their secular counterparts. Second, alloparenting, or the provisioning of childcare by individuals other than the parents, has been shown to positively influence a woman's fertility and improve children's health and developmental outcomes. We suspect that religious cooperation enables the high fertility characteristic of religious communities. Specifically, religious systems motivate alloparental behaviors among extended kin networks and unrelated co-religionists to enable large family sizes of successful children. This could happen either directly with women receiving more help with rearing their children, or indirectly if religious mothers receive more help with things such as errands, then they have more time to directly invest in children themselves. Further, we expect that these dynamics become more pronounced in post-industrialized environments where kin networks break down or are more dispersed. That is, we suspect that, I'm speaking on behalf of everyone, but that is, we expect that religion exerts a stronger influence on reproduction in post-industrialized settings. Our team will test several predictions derived from these hypotheses with the substantial available secondary data on religion and fertility. While there's a lot of data on religion and fertility, not much of this has been subjected to evolutionary analyses. And while these studies have been and will continue to be informative, these data don't allow for complete tests of our hypotheses. So our team of anthropologists and demographers will therefore conduct cross-cultural studies of over 8,000 Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Mormon, and Muslim participants from Bangladesh, the Gambia, India, Malawi, and the United States. And these are societies that range dramatically in their degree of modernization, as well as majority and minority religious dynamics. So I just wanted to briefly introduce the fantastic team we have. I'll just start on the top left and then go across. So we have Laura Spake here at the University of Otago, Mary Schenk at Penn State, Nushe Hassan at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Alec Weitzel at UConn, myself, Joseph Watts here at Otago, Rebecca Sear at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Susie Schaffnit at Pennsylvania State University, Robert Lynch, who's also at Penn State, Rich Sosis at UConn, and Anna Katrina Peterson here at Otago. So as I mentioned, we're doing secondary data analysis and novel data collection at 5 main field sites as soon as COVID allows. We're working with demographic health and surveillance sites at MATLAB in Bangladesh on the right, which is actually not well positioned. That's sort of in the Philippines or something. And in Birbhum, India, where there are primarily Hindus, in Karonga, Malawi, primarily Christians, and West Kiang in the Gambia, primarily Muslims, and then a novel field site that we're developing in Pittsburgh. We have 10 research questions investigating broadly religion and fertility, the relationship between modernization and kin density and religion, alloparental support, and child development. In total, from these 10 research questions, we have 22 specific predictions that we're testing. All of these are pre-registered on the Open Science Framework. There's proof of that. We also have various pre-registrations of our secondary data analysis. What I'm going to describe is a couple preliminary tests of secondary data analysis that I've been a part of. And the first is just that at a countrywide level, do the members of religious communities engage in greater alloparental support? So for this study, I used data from a study that I'm a part of, which is the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, which started with a random sample of registered voters from the New Zealand electoral roll in 2009. New Zealand is relatively unique in that you can get access to lists of everybody in the population, so you can do random samples relatively easily. We currently have about 60,000 people enrolled in the study. It's a 20-year longitudinal study. The plot on the right just shows where all the participants come from in New Zealand. Those are all the population centers. The project is funded largely by Templeton as well. This is a questionnaire-based study. Participants complete the study every year. There's an online version. Some questions are rotated in and out. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the study, on the right is an image of all of the surveys that came in one day a couple years ago, but that's a fairly typical day. On the left, those are all of the surveys in boxes for 1 year. I'll just point out in the middle of that image on the left, in the blue hoodie, is Chris Sibley from the University of Auckland, who started and runs the study. So in this study itself, this was a few years ago before we had 60,000 participants. It's increased dramatically in the last few years. There was a sample of 15,000 people in total. Because the survey isn't set up to study alloparenting or directly test our hypotheses, what we did was we characterized people as at risk for alloparenting if they didn't currently have children of their own who were 18 or under. So it's a relatively conservative test. And on the survey, we asked, how many hours have you cared for children in the past week? And we built multivariate, multi-level Bayesian regression models, adjusting for denomination. So we're not examining any difference in alloparenting across denominations, but rather at the countrywide level in New Zealand, are religious people engaging in more alloparenting or care of children more generally than secular people. So I'm going to show you several tables in a row here that describe the results. These first few are fertility models, so whether or not religious people have more children. And we examine religious identification and ritual frequency. So religious identification is just a measure of, do you identify with the religion? If you do, how important is that religion to how you see yourself on a scale from 1 to 7? So people who do not affiliate with a religion are coded as a 0. And people who do affiliate are coded from 1 to 7. So it's a scale from 0 to 7. And this is the probability of zero deflation, which basically means whether or not people have at least one child. So these are predictors of having at least one child. And you can see that religious identification is positively associated with having a child, while there's no reliable estimate for ritual frequency. One of the things that's interesting to me, and it sort of corresponds to levels of alloparenting, which I'll describe in a second, but Maori, the indigenous population here, and Pacific Islanders, I'm sorry, I'll get back, both have more children than here. The baseline is Pakeha, or people of European descent. Now, among people who do have children, you see both religious identification and ritual frequency associated with the total number of children amongst people who have children. And now, in terms of alloparenting, this is again zero deflation. So this is whether or not people engaged in any alloparenting or any child care at all. And you see that for both religious identification and ritual frequency, the coefficients cross 0. So it's not a very strong effect, but most of the mass of the probability density is on the positive side, and particularly for ritual frequency. And out of those people who do engage in at least any alloparenting at all, we do not see a strong effect of religion here. As I mentioned before, you see higher levels of fertility amongst Maori and Pacific Islanders, and also lower levels of fertility amongst people of Asian ethnicity. And you see that the levels of alloparenting roughly correspond to the levels of fertility. People with higher fertility, those groups with higher fertility are engaging in more alloparenting as well. So to summarize this sort of preliminary test with in New Zealand, rates of alloparenting are pretty low. Though these estimates are confined because of the way the data are asked of people. These are combined to people who don't currently have their own children under the age of 18. So we can't examine with these data whether or not people who have kids themselves are also engaging in some alloparenting, which is probably way more frequent than someone who doesn't have their own kids looking after someone else's kids. However, after adjusting for ethnic differences, we do find a small effect that religious individuals engage in more alloparenting. Roughly 3 1/3 out of 100 religious people engage in alloparenting. Non-reproductive religious people engage in alloparenting, where their number is much smaller for non-religious alloparenting. Or non-religious individuals. This sort of gives us a preliminary idea, at least a proof of concept, that it seems like religious people are engaging a little bit more alloparenting, particularly as a conservative measure. But does alloparenting, or more generally support to mothers, impact mother's fertility, but also child outcomes? And for this, we worked with a different data set, the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, which is often referred to as the Children of the 90s study. This is a panel study of focal children and their parents living around the city of Bristol, England. Initially, the ALSPAC sample recruited pregnant women with an expected delivery date that fell between the 1st of April 91 and 31st of December 92. Some mothers and children were added later. We examined data from mothers and a focal child during the first 10 years of life, the child's life. After exclusions, 13,446 children and the mothers were left for analysis. However, owing to missing data, the number of mothers and children included in our models varied from 1,766 to 8,209, depending on the variables specified in the models and their rates of missing data. We used a 4-level measure, ordinal measure of frequency of attendance at a house of worship, none at least once a year, monthly or weekly. Our first series of analyses examined mothers' social support using 2 measures. The first, a composite measure of social network support drawn from the sum of 10 questions, and then a binary measure of aid from co-religionists. The social support measure was used as a proxy for general social support and assessed a mother's potential to draw both practical and emotional support, as well as frequency of contact with kin, in-laws, and friends. So some of these questions are like, how many friends do you have? How many people can you borrow 100 pounds from? The aid from co-religionist variable was derived from the question, do you obtain help and support from members of your religious group? Across all analyses, we again built multivariate, multi-level Bayesian regression models. Here, participant ID and year were included as varying effects in all analyses. We built models for support, fertility, and child cognitive performance, operationalized with scores on compulsory national tests. Upon entering school at age 5 or 6, this is the entry assessment. Then again at age 6 or 7, this is the stage 1 assessment. And then at age 8, this is the WISC-3. I have no idea how you say that, but I assume it's not WISC, WISC-3. And we also built measures, looked at the effect of sibling number and support on child height. We tested 4 predictions, whether or not maternal church attendance is positively associated with social network support, as well as aid from co-religionists, whether or not that church attendance was positively associated with fertility, whether or not social network support and aid from co-religionists mitigated the negative effect of sibling numbers on physiological, and here physiological development is just height, but also cognitive development. So I'll show you some of the results of these tests. These coefficient plots show the outcomes of the 2 support models. And in order to interpret these coefficients, to the right of the dotted line represent a positive association with the outcome variable, and those to the left represent a negative association. The plot on the left represents the results of a model predicting a mother's social network over the 10 years of the data we analyzed. Religious mothers have larger social networks. There's no difference between the networks of mothers who attend at different frequencies. The plot to the right shows the results of a model predicting whether mothers get help and support from members of their congregations. You can see there are increases in aid from co-religionists at higher frequencies of church attendance. Also, as suggested by the year variable, social networks declined over time while support for co-religionists remained relatively constant. These plots show the results of the fertility models. The plot on the left illustrates that over the 10 years of data, increases in church frequency were associated with increases in fertility. The plot in the middle shows that over time, women who received help and aid from co-religionists, that's the blue line, had higher fertility. This is after adjusting for church frequency and the other socioeconomic covariates in the models. Social support, by contrast, was associated with reduction in fertility. The plot on the right shows that at maximum levels of social support, which is the blue line, women had lower fertility than those with minimum levels of support, the red line. These findings suggest that religious and secular networks have divergent effects on a mother's fertility. This final plot shows the results of 3 models, each with a different measure of cognitive performance as an outcome. Here, child test scores at each of 3 time points represented by a different color. The first thing to point out is that there is a negative relationship between sibling number and child test scores at each of the 3 time points we examined. This is replicating some earlier studies that found the same thing. The second more general thing to point out, I think, is that it's relatively well known that these tests are biased, and our models reveal evidence of these biases. So for example, mother's education and mother's household income, about 2/3 of the way down, are associated with increases in child test performance. In terms of our hypotheses, the models reveal a positive association between a mother's social network support and aid from co-religionists on a child's test score. Particularly, these effects are particularly stronger or show greater evidence at later stages of development. These findings are by no means conclusive, given that not all of our models show the predictive positive relationship between support and child outcomes, but do provide some suggestive evidence that a mother's social networks may buffer the detrimental effects of sibling number on child development. So just to briefly summarize this second preliminary test, religious women have higher levels of social support and receive more aid from members of their congregation. Co-religious aid is relatively constant over time and is associated with higher fertility. Generalized social support is associated with lower fertility and generally declines across at least the first 10 years of the focal child's life. Social support and aid from co-religionists was positively associated with cognitive development. I didn't show the models here, although we replicate the effect of sibling number negatively influencing child height, there's no evidence that mother social support mitigates that effect to any extent. Just sort of what we're working on in our future directions. Again, we're continuing our secondary data analysis. So check out our upcoming talks, which I'll allude to or describe in a second. And we hope to be able to conduct fieldwork maybe by the end of the year. So some of our upcoming talks, Rebecca Sear is going to be talking about family fertility and child success. Where does research on cooperative childcare go next? That's in about a month. Robert Lynch is analyzing secondary data from Bangladesh and examining the effects of market integration on women's kin density and social networks. And I did mention that we have two primary things that we're working on, fieldwork and secondary data analysis, but Laura Spake also collected some novel data online during COVID, examining alloparental networks in the US and UK. And that's with about slightly over 1,600 women. So she's going to be discussing that. And then in August, Joseph Watts is going to be discussing some work on modeling secularization across nation states. We hope that these seminars will, I guess they'll last about a year, but we have some other speakers, Saman Naz, Alec Weitzel, Susie Schaffnit, Mary Schenk, Rich Sosis, and Anusha Hassan will be speaking. And maybe by the end of the series, we'll have some of our field data that we can describe for you all. If you want to follow along with us, we have a website, evolutionarydemographyofreligion.org. We also have a Twitter page, EvoDemReligion. Feel free to follow us, please follow us. And that is all that I have for you today. This, again, is sort of a preliminary introduction, and I still know everybody. So I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm definitely going to do that. And reduce the security settings. And I will now okay, I believe everyone, if they want, can unmute themselves. So I'm happy to field any questions if anyone would like to ask anything. So most of the people attending are involved in the project and know all of this, or have been authors on some of the research. So there's probably not a lot to ask.
John, if no one's jumping in with a question, maybe you want to just speculate a little bit on how you think COVID is going to impact all of this, you know, the alloparenting and maybe some of the predictions. I mean, when the project started, obviously the pandemic was not a primary issue. Obviously, with the pandemic, fieldwork has been delayed, but the pandemic has also impacted, you know, some of the ways we actually anticipate people to be behaving with regard to alloparenting. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on that?
I can certainly speculate without any data, but Laura and Anusha actually, so in Laura's survey, they asked, or we asked, about the alloparental help that mothers are receiving during COVID and how that's changed. So what they used to receive and what they're receiving now. And this was 6-7 months ago. And I know that she and Anusha just submitted an abstract to present some of those data, but my guess is that the conference is so far away that maybe they didn't really have a chance yet to look at the data that much. I could be wrong, so if Laura or Anusha want to jump in, they can. But my guess is that, so, I mean, the whole idea is that parents have finite energy budgets, and particularly with not having to go to work, parents have more time, I would guess, to invest in children, so there might be less demand. So that it may not, so certainly alloparental networks would have declined, right? Because of social isolation. But there may not be as much of a demand because parents would have been home with children a lot more. So it may have, the reductions in alloparenting may have been negated by the more time parents would have been at home. But I don't, some parents also, I guess, would still have to work. And so I don't know, like it's maybe a little bit better to have the kid in the room with you while you're working rather than being at work and the kid being somewhere else. But so I don't really know. I wouldn't be surprised if the parental investment during COVID went up, which might mean that there wouldn't be a huge effect. Just where the investment is coming from would have changed. Laura, did you have you had a chance? Sorry to do this to you, but I know you're like really busy analyzing lots of data, but have you had a chance to look at this at all?
Yeah, and Anusha, feel free to jump in if you want to as well. I know it's quite late over there, so you might not be feeling up to it. And we haven't looked at the data too closely yet, but it seems like women are relying more on carers that are residing in their home. So the people who are, available to them within their bubble of a sort are contributing more childcare than they used to. And the ones that are outside of their home are not able to provide as much childcare. So women are reporting, I think 60% or more of them are reporting that they get less help than they used to, for sure. And so as we keep moving forward, we're going to hope to figure out how that impacts not only the carer networks, who is helping and how much they're helping and who's able to continue helping, but also how that impacts maternal mental health and their ability to do paid work. Because some women in qualitative studies around the world are reporting that they're spending so much time taking care of kids at home that they can't work as much as they used to. And we suspect that there's probably a social economic status component to this as well. Whereas women who, some women are relying more on paid care and, they can afford to continue relying on paid care, and some others are losing their jobs and they can't rely on paid care anymore. So I don't have a lot of clear-cut answers yet, but hopefully in the coming months, we'll have some better answers for you.
Thanks, Laura. I think you covered everything we've done so far.
And Rich, you know this, but it's worth pointing out too that we have incorporated COVID questions into the cross-cultural surveys as well. So hopefully when we do field work, we'll be able to understand how those dynamics may vary in different contexts with different family structures. I think Mark Collard wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, John. Thanks. That looks like a great project. Just wondering about confounds, and specifically, I'm not sure I formulated this properly, this question, but seems like one of the major constraints on decision making about how many kids to have, at least in the West, is the availability of housing with 2 or 3 bedrooms. And I'm just wondering whether there's differences in attitudes, or whether you're going to look at differences in attitudes to how many kids it's appropriate to have in a single bedroom, and differences in that attitude between religious people and non-religious people?
I don't know that we had thought about it exactly in that way. So in some of our work, we've asked about ideal fertility, and examined some of the socioeconomic covariates of variance in ideal fertility. There's, of course, I think, cultural differences in what's acceptable in terms of sharing rooms. I'm going to do the annoying thing that anthropologists do and say what happens where I do field work. But in Fiji, where I do field work, 8 people will sleep in the same room. And for example, here in New Zealand, there are a great number of Fijians who live here who I think would have no problem with that. So I think it would maybe have more to do with sort of ethnic variation in norms for what's appropriate in housing that may not necessarily correspond to variation in religious norms. There's also this problem that I think Mary and probably Rebecca know more about than I do, which is that ideal fertility isn't always or is rarely achieved. And so those, even if we did find some variance, it might not necessarily correspond with actual behavior.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm not sure I phrased it properly. I mean, somewhere like Vancouver, people are incredibly I am here, incredibly constrained in their ability to even approximate anything close to their ideal fertility because of the lack of availability of apartments with more than 2 rooms. And that's obviously an attitude phenomenon, right? So I'm just wondering within, I don't know, whether it would hold, but my sense is that there might be within a Western community, the religious people would have a different attitude to the number of kids they're willing to put in a bedroom, for how long they're willing to have those kids in the bedroom, than a non-religious community.
I was just gonna, hi Mark, I was gonna say
Hi,
a
Mary.
couple of things. One is that I think it's a really interesting question. And I think if existing data for a Western context already exist where you have some attitudes towards bedroom size or more like, space constraints in general, then that kind of analysis could be done. The data we're planning on collecting in the US is in Pittsburgh, so it's in a city, but not quite Vancouver in terms of how expensive it is to live in certain elements. Exactly. So my guess is that what we probably can do in the data that we're planning on collecting is we can get information on the size. I don't know this is in there so far, but it's actually a useful thing to know on the size of the dwellings that people have. And we can look at variation within a community. So within the US community, within the communities in other parts of the world, which are all actual communities, right? They're nearby locations, people in a series of villages or in a series of towns that are near each other. And we can get a sense of whether or not it looks like there is some kind of consistent variation among more or less religious people in those contexts. Because a lot of that, I would expect there's a lot of cross-cultural variation in just what's considered normative. But then I would also expect, to be honest with you, a kind of a coevolution of these norms with fertility norms in a community. So that if you're in, there are a couple of high fertility communities in Pittsburgh that we're interested in oversampling with our survey so that we ideally have more information. For example, Orthodox Jews in that region. There may be also kind of a, if you're in a community with higher fertility, the norms of allowing kids to sleep in the same bedroom for longer or an idea that you should have your own bedroom might be different. And so you're suggesting a situation in which the bedroom shape, the bedroom availability, or the room, the space availability is driving decision making, but it may also be that fertility norms drive norms about
Sure.
space.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure that our research design is going to allow us to really untangle that in a meaningful way, though some other existing data sets might. But I do think we ought to at least have some ability to proxy space availability versus fertility across families within a field site that might be relevant here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And we also have some qualitative data. So, I mean, we can decide, Susie can decide if she wants to, push on the topic of space or something like that when we start doing we're going to do some open-ended focus group discussions, actually for the Pittsburgh site starting quite soon.
That'll be interesting.
And we'll see, because of the questions being asked on the front end are quite open-ended. My guess would be if they were being asked in Vancouver, we'd actually get people saying, I can't have 3 kids because this apartments are so small, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in Pittsburgh, we'll see if they mention that or not. And then if they do mention that, then we're going to make sure that any really key issues that are mentioned by people are then added to the survey. We already have a draft of the survey that's been translated into how many languages across lots of sites, but we haven't been able to pretest yet because of COVID. And so we're just beginning the process, but we have a mechanism built in to update surveys with pertinent local information. So we should be able to add a little bit of stuff if it seems like people on our sites are mentioning space constraints.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, and in the focus groups, there are questions that get at sort of ideal family size and why you wouldn't want to have more kids. So it'd be up to the participants to reveal whether or not something like housing would be an issue. This probably is off topic, but the issue is, and I'm not familiar with the literature, and maybe Rich might be, but of fertility and maybe something like carrying capacity in different settings, where rather than housing, it would just be food availability or something like that. But maybe there are literatures there that would speak to these issues in a different context, but it's basically resource availability and fertility preferences. Yeah.
My guess is the East Asian literature would probably have some clues here if we wanted to look at it, because you have these major space constraint concerns in lots of East Asian cities.
Nick, it looks like you have a question, and it also looks like the weather there is much better than near the Antarctica where I am.
It has improved. It's up in the 70s today. Thanks very much for this talk, and I'm interested in whether you're seeing any differences or if you have any predictions about how particular religious identities or religious teachings related to particular identities about fertility might play into this. So just thinking probably naively and crudely, in the ALSPAC data, are there differences between Catholics and Protestants, or does the relationship hold up really across religious folks?
So there's very little diversity in that sample.
Right.
They're almost all Anglican.
Okay.
There are a few Catholics, but we made the decision basically to just have denominations as random effects, and we didn't really examine those differences, largely because we didn't expect any. I could go back and possibly look. I know that in New Zealand there were there's very little in the way of denominational differences. Sort of the ethnic differences swamp everything else.
The swamp
at least.
Okay.
Mary, you wanted to say something, I think.
Yeah, I have 2 comments. We have some very preliminary analyses, which which we've already workshopped at a internal group at Penn State, multi-departmental internal group, using DHS data from India, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, where we look across communities. This is a student of mine who's done this analysis, where we look across communities in places where Hindus are in the majority, and Muslims are in the minority, and versus communities where Muslims are in the majority and Hindus are in the minority. It's a somewhat complicated analysis. I can't really do it justice quickly, but what we found a really something quite interesting so far, and that was that we saw consistently higher fertility among Muslims, which people have found before in South Asia, but we found really different relationships between minority and majority status across countries. So the situation you see in India is different from the situations in Bangladesh and Nepal, which look quite similar in terms of their dynamics, despite having different minority and majority religions. So I think that paper is in the works, and we have a draft, but it's part of someone's dissertation, and we're probably a few months, 2 or 3 months from being able to circulate it. Probably this summer we can circulate it. But I think some of our analyses are going to allow us to look at this. We also expect to be able to look at this, hopefully, among different Christian denominations in the Pittsburgh sample, once we have that data collected. So we might be able to get a little more purchase on that with some of our analyses.
Right, and
So, thank you.
and Nick, as you know, a lot of the secondary data don't have very good religion questions, or they have very few. So getting at, I think, the kind of the identity norm differences that you're talking about is quite hard from most of the secondary data that exists. So we have a good number of questions, as Mary alludes to, in our cross-cultural surveys that can probably capture those a bit better. This analysis is possibly, well, it's definitely much further away than the one Mary's just suggested, but I've analyzed using the DHS data from 36 countries, I believe, differences in majority and minority fertility differentials, and in sort of market integrated, non-industrialized settings. There really aren't there isn't much of a difference in fertility levels between majority and minority religions, but they really start to emerge in urban settings. So the identity of being, and with minority religions being higher in those settings, higher fertility in those settings, it's not universal, it's not in every setting, but overall across these countries. So I think that indicates that maybe the identity becomes more important, and its relation to fertility becomes more important as societies modernize, which would make some sense, I think. Does anyone else have any questions or anything they would like to add? Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. This was sort of a test run, and I was volunteered, I guess, to go first. I anticipate, as we go along, hopefully more people will attend. I personally would find it more interesting when people were talking about specific research findings than a general overview of something. So I hope that everyone who's here is able to come back next month and see Rebecca. I'd like to thank you all for being here, particularly Anusha. I think it's got to be like a midnight there or something like that, and Rebecca. It's quite late there, I know, as well. Anyway, it's good to see you. Thank you all, and I'll talk to you soon.